Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 13. Today we are going to talk about some of the last couple critical and integrated theories. So if you recall from last week, I posted an announcement saying that the schedule of what we are going to talk about this week is just slightly altered. Today we're talking about critical and integrated theories, and then on Thursday in person we will be talking about the street crimes, violent and property street crimes, in preparation for exam 2. So today we're going to finish up in this area of critical and integrated theory by first talking about feminist criminology and then moving on to talking about some attempts to integrate theories into larger theories of crime. So in terms of feminist criminology, this is really a movement that started in the 1970s. People had been, at least to some extent, showing some interest in females committing crime before this, but it really took the women's liberation movement in the 1970s to really bring attention to the fact that almost the entire history of our field has been a study of male offending. So what feminist criminologists pointed out in the 1970s is a lot of those traditional theories that you've already learned about in this class, theories like social learning theory or social control, strain theories, they really exclude women. They either just throw them into studies and put control variables in to account for them, or they just don't study women committing crime. So feminist criminologists point out the fact that there is an entire group of people in this country, females, who in terms of their offending, we really know very little about. Most people just assume that they behave in a similar way to men, but feminist criminologists highlight the fact that simply assuming and not actually doing a study of this group is inadequate. So people who study feminist criminology can really be divided up into a couple different areas, and we will talk about each of these throughout the course of today's lecture. There are some people who focus on the pattern of victimization of women and how women who get repeatedly and for a long period of time victimized in their lives often become the women who enter into the criminal justice system. So studying the victimization of women is important to criminal justice because these two populations, women who are victimized and women who end up becoming delinquent and criminal, that's an overlapping population. There are also people who are particularly interested in what we now call the gender gap. So, in terms of gender differences in crime, why is it that women have such lower rates of offending than men? What is it about being a male? What is it about the male gender in this country that maybe makes you more likely or makes you more able to commit crime? So that's another area of study. And then finally, there are people who examine the criminal justice system itself to figure out if our justice system has systematically become a gendered justice system. And is it a problem or an issue that women get such different, often much more lenient treatment than men? And, some of the implications of making that treatment more equal are discussed. So, as I said, this movement really started in the 1970s. You can find evidence of people who have studied female offending historically, but it really took the authors in the women's liberation movement to kind of get the ball rolling on criminology as a social science discipline, looking at female offending. So, back in the 1970s, there were a few authors who very specifically wrote about females and women committing crime. In the 1970s, you had Frida Adler and Rita Simon, both writing books, really, qualitative research, doing interviews, conducting kind of field research, studying women who commit periodic and frequent amounts of crime throughout their life. If you remember back to earlier in the semester, we talked about Frida Adler's work, and we talked about this book, Sisters in Crime. And what she predicted in that book, if you remember, is that now in the 1970s, now that women are starting to act more and more like men and are assuming more and more of a traditionally male role in our society, she predicted that women were going to also commit crime at the same levels. Well, we know that that hasn't quite happened, but what we do know is that women, starting in right around the 1970s and moving on into today, began kind of abandoning their traditional roles in our society. They began leaving the home, not just becoming a housekeeper, and becoming much more independent, autonomous. And one of the suggestions at the time was that they were taking on more traditionally male qualities, being aggressive, being assertive, being independent and intelligent. The idea that a woman could have these qualities didn't really used to be very much didn't really used to be thought of very much. And what the liberal feminists believed is the more that women take on male qualities, the more that they are going to commit crime like men. Well, we know that that isn't necessarily what happened. If you remember back to our lecture about crime trends, we know that the amount of female offending has increased, but they're still nowhere near the level of men. There's another faction of female feminist criminology that really tries to examine the gender gap, really tries to examine why it is that there's such a big difference between the genders, male and female, in terms of how much crime people are committing out of each of them. So why is it, a radical feminist would ask, why is it that women are so much less likely in almost every different type of crime to get into trouble, to be committing criminal acts? And according to radical feminists, what's the most important and the most defining gender role in our society overall is the idea of patriarchy. The theme of patriarchy, according to a radical feminist in this country, is so prevailing and so influential that it has really systematically, over time, socialized women into roles that make it very unlikely that they're going to commit crime. So in other words, essentially what a radical feminist is saying is, because this society is set up, traditionally anyway, by men who are in control of government, of power, of law, of the home, of the workforce, essentially because of that, according to a radical feminist, they are in a position to be committing more crimes. They're in a more aggressive, domineering position. And because women's role has traditionally been submissive, being controlled by the men in their life, that makes them very unlikely, according to a radical feminist, to go out and commit crime. So that's one perspective of the radical feminists. Radical feminists also point out the fact that what we should be interested in understanding is how it is that women who put themselves in positions where they're likely to be victimized might cause they themselves, problems in terms of criminal behavior themselves. So one thing radical feminists point out is, in the history of criminal justice research, really, you're talking about explaining crime and victimization. Historically, you're talking about explaining males attacking and victimizing males. And what a radical feminist points out is the fact that women's victimization has been essentially ignored. And that's a problem because, according to them, it is the patriarchal system that we've set up in this country, the kind of constant oppression and victimization of women, that causes those women who do offend to have these problems. So women, in other words, women who are particularly controlled and women who are repeatedly victimized by the kind of domineering men in their lives. According to a radical feminist, that's a big reason why some of those women then go out and commit crime and get into trouble. An example of someone who's done work in this area is a researcher named Peggy Giordano. And this is research that's been done really in the past decade or so, past 10 to 15 years. And what Giordano really examined is this issue of socialization. Because remember, if you're a radical feminist and you're a feminist criminologist, you believe that women don't commit crime primarily as much as men because of how they are socialized. That we are socialized into gender roles which usually mean that women are not going to be engaging in activities that are going to get them into trouble. Well, Giordano doesn't necessarily refute this, but she has a problem with then using that to explain those women who do commit crime. Because if you think about it this way, if there are differences in how we socialize, men versus women, that really can't explain the actions of the young women who adopt a criminal lifestyle. If men commit crime because they are socialized into a gender role that encourages aggression and independence and intelligence and assertiveness, and that's why they commit crime, why do the women who commit crime do so? You have to be able to believe, in other words, that some women are socialized like men. And, Giordano kind of has a problem really believing that. What she instead suggests is that what we should be interested in when we study women offenders, female offenders, is this theme that tends to run throughout many women who commit crime, which is a negative or coercive relationship with the men in their life. That females who are frequent, chronic, serious offenders are also women who are engaging in very damaging and negative relationships with either a significant other, a spouse, a boyfriend, a father figure. That tends to be a recurring theme for these women. So according to Giordano, instead of just throwing out traditional theory in terms of women, what she's suggesting is instead we need to combine kind of those classic criminology theories with new ideas of the gendered processes that are at work, putting men into more of a position to commit crime than women. So in other words, Giordano, she's writing in the 21st century, the 2000s, and she's not suggesting that if you want to study female offending, you have to completely rewrite the book on criminology. She's not suggesting that we throw out all of the theories that you've learned about in this class. But what she is suggesting is we shouldn't assume that women go through the processes that are in these theories in the exact same way. What she's suggesting is that because there are differences in socialization out there, and because, according to her, committing crime is a gendered process, and men do it very differently than women, we need to have a new idea of how to factor women in to traditional theories. She has a quote in one of her papers saying, you can't just add women and stir to these traditional theories. You can't just throw them in and assume that they're going to behave the same way. Instead, we need to study them and perhaps adjust theories to take into account the ideas that there are these gendered processes at work.